Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to today's ICP webinar. We have an excellent presentation today on Indigenous Maori approaches to healing. I am Dr. Dominique Eugene. I'm one of the board members of the International Council of Psychologists. I'm speaking to you today from Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. Our speakers today are Doctors Carrie Clifford and Dr. Eleanor Brittain. Ms. Megan Somerville will be the moderator. For those of you who do not know, the International Council of Psychologists, the host of today's webinar, is an organization of mostly psychologists, which with a focus on exploring psychology and human rights, dignity, and justice. In addition to hosting a number of interest groups on health, on decolonization, and on wellness, ICP hosts an annual meeting. This year's annual meeting will take place on December 10th on Zoom, and the theme will be Celebrate Human Rights. That will be again on December 10th. Please stay tuned, follow our webpage to find out more information. Also, our annual ICP conference will take place in Rotterdam in April 3rd through the 5th. Anybody who's interested in submitting an abstract for that conference, the last day of the conference abstract proposals are due on October 31st. So if anybody's interested, please feel free to check out our webpage. We'll put more information about our webpage in the chat so you could follow for more details. Membership in ICP is open to all, and we invite you, members or not, to join us for any of our conferences. You can find out more on the ICP website. The link will be posted in the chat. For those of you who are not members, be sure to know that the Special Discovery ICP Membership Initiative, you can always join us at any point, and for the rest of the year, your membership will be free. Before we begin today's webinar, there are just a few housekeeping comments. First, please ask questions in the QA function on your screen or via the chat. We will try to get to all your questions during the discussion. Second, we will automatically send attendance certificates to everyone who is with us in this meeting for at least 40 minutes. We send the certificates to the names and emails we see on screen, whichever one that you have signed up with. So if you're using someone else's computer or have a different email from your login, please send a separate email indicating how you're watching us to ICP Incorporated info@gmail.com. I'll also put that information on the webpage. Now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Ms. Megan Somerville to give you more information about our presenters.
Kia ora mai tātou. Te ki o te manu e rua, korore ki te atua maunga rongo ki te whenua, whakaaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. A ko ai au te tōku mama, no te atiawa ki waiwe tū, ko te whanganoi a tara tū turu ahau. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa. Thanks so much for coming. We know that it's all times of the day and night for us all. So thank you so much for being willing to be able to come to this presentation today, where it's really centred on the Indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and being from the bottom of the world, our time zone's a bit different. So we're kind of just finishing our work days here. I'm going to hand it straight on to our two presenters, but just want to firstly talk about very briefly in my introduction to you, I spoke of two of our prophets who are very big in Taranaki, which is on the west coast of New Zealand, of which I'm a tribal member of. And that was really just giving greetings in our language to reo Maori. So Carrie, Eleanor, over to you.
Kia ora, Carrie.
Kia ora. Tuatahi, tina koutou katoa, no mai haere mai tautu mai ki tēnei kōrero. Tēnei te mihi atu ki a koe Megan, e o ka whakawaria e tēnei rā. Ellie and I share a warm welcome to everyone for joining us today. We will use te reo throughout the presentation, which is an important thing to do when we are talking about Indigenous and Maori approaches to health and wellbeing, but we will do our absolute best to translate as we go as well. So please do let us know if there's anything we've missed. Here we go. Ko ai au, so who am I, or what waters do I flow from? He uri tēnei o Kaitahu Waitaha Kati Mamoi. So I'm from 3 iwi from the lower South Island in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I primarily grew up down there and also did a lot of my studies and PhD research in the lower South Island at the University of Otago. And now I work full-time as a clinical psychologist working for Te Runanga o Tua Rangatira. So I want to mihi and acknowledge to them the iwi of the Porirua region and the lower region of the North Island, and I'm really grateful to work for a tribal organisation and to be able to bring kaupapa Māori approaches to the mahi or the work that I do with the clients. And so I will pass it over to my colleague and friend, Dr. Ellie Britton.
Tēnā koe, Carrie, tēnā koutou hoki. Ko Ngāti Kahungani ki te Wairua, ko Ngāti Rākau Pāka, ko rongo mai wahine ngā iwi, ko Ellie, ko Eleanor rānei, sō kuingoa. Greetings to everyone. So my nations here in Aotearoa, New Zealand are on the east coast of the North Island, or a part of the east coast, sort of. And they are, as listed there, Kahungani, Rākau Pāka and rongo mai wahine, all closely neighbouring collectives, I guess, and so that's where my family, my whānau come from, and that's where I grew up and where I continue to connect to today. I am, like Carrie, a clinical psychologist and also a lecturer and co-director for the Centre for Indigenous Psychology's Te Toi Arapaki here at Massey University on our Wellington campus, which if any of you are looking closely at that wee map of New Zealand, is at the southern end of the North Island. Yeah, kia ora, greetings.
Beautiful. And what Ellie and I hope to do today is start by sharing our respective research to give you an idea of some really tangible examples of what Indigenous and Māori approaches to healing might look like. And then we hope to thread together and discuss some common themes across both of our research, both kaupapa Māori and the use of storytelling. And then if we're on track, we will leave some time for questions as well. So please add any questions that you have in that chat, and Megan, our moderator, is going to keep an eye on them, and hopefully we'll tie it all together really beautifully. So my PhD research looked at the use of pūrākau and Indigenous storytelling in mental health settings. And so my thesis was actually titled Pūrākau Tuku Iho, and what that speaks to is our pūrākau, our stories and our storytelling processes that come down or have been passed down throughout generations from our tipuna. And like many Māori and Indigenous researchers and health practitioners, I think a lot of our life experiences inspire or shape the research and the work that we do. And so for myself, this was true in the sense that through a kaupapa which was called Auraki Bound, named after my maunga, my mountain, myself and a few other people from my iwi actually for 21 days retraced the footsteps of our tipuna throughout Te Waipounamu, the lower South Island, and we learned about our history. And so at the same time, I'm having this beautiful cultural reconnection, I'm learning, I'm feeling positive in both my physical and mental health and well-being. And I'm also studying to be a clinical psychologist. And at that time, I felt that there was quite two very, very different approaches to mental health and well-being. And so that's what sparked my interest in thinking about how can we use our cultural practices and how can we use our stories as a way in which we can foster health and well-being. And so my research involved interviews with 31 interviews around Māori storytelling in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And then I was so fortunate to be able to extend the research and include 9 interviews with Native American, Native Hawaiian, and Alaskan Native peoples as well. And so together, this became a really rich conversation to draw from. And today, we're absolutely just getting a snippet of the findings, but I wanted to share with you some of the benefits in which we were able to see when we talked to these different psychologists like yourself, but also a broad range of mental health workers, including elders that worked in mental health spaces and used pūrākau and other Indigenous stories. And they really highlighted a lot of the cultural benefits in which can come from using our stories in mental health settings. For example, really strongly helping to foster our clients' sense of belonging and connection to ourselves, but also our family, the people that have come before us, and also the place in which we live or the place which we come from. And as psychologists, we absolutely know the importance of belonging for mental health and wellbeing as a protective factor. It also allowed us to bring Māori worldviews and values into sessions and make them really explicit in the sessions and the mahi and the work that we do with our clients, and it also helped to foster identity development. We also saw from the narratives shared a range of psychological benefits. So those were things like in using the stories and this indirect way of communicating, it helped externalize some of the difficulties that our clients were facing. It helped foster discussion, in particular about really sensitive topics or maybe difficult to talk about topics. And we also saw that these stories provided this way to mirror some of the difficulties and challenges or the hope that our whānau could maybe experience as well. And one thing that I really enjoyed learning about was how important those stories were for normalizing some of the difficulties our clients were going through. And so for our clients to be able to see, and for us as well as practitioners, that our tipuna or our ancestors actually went through very similar challenges to what we're experiencing, it can help reduce a lot of shame and guilt and isolation that the clients were feeling at that time. And they also helped foster some inner reflection or some understanding of what was happening for them, and also identify solutions or pathways moving forward that they maybe want to take or didn't want to take. And these examples really came from the stories that the clients were hearing in their sessions. And you'll also see there, the last point I have is around some of the relational benefits that using Indigenous storytelling brought into the therapeutic session. So one of the things that was talked about was the importance of the stories for building trust actually between the client and the clinician, and the power that has for helping develop the therapeutic alliance, and how that can foster connection not only for the client themselves in the space that they're sitting and the land that they're sitting on, but also with the clinician and other supports that they might have in their life. And overall, it was really said that the use of storytelling was an important factor that helped with engagement in services and also retention in services. And for a lot of services here in New Zealand, at times there are lower rates of retention in services for our Māori clients as a result of the therapy not really meeting their needs. So this was a really positive outcome that we saw. And so from the research, I was able to pull together a bit of a framework based on the different factors that the elders or that the clinicians were telling me were really important. And this helped develop the Tōku Aharu framework, which you'll see here has 5 main elements. So we've got the element of, yes, it's important to know the pūrākau or the story itself. So we need to know how the story goes, the main parts of the story in order to use it in a meaningful way. But we also need to more broadly understand, how does that story, or how does Māori storytelling practices fit within a wider Māori worldview, so that we can anchor that story, and we can also ensure that the pūrākau and the messages inside are actually congruent and fit with a Māori worldview in order that it sits well with the client. We can also see there that right at the heart, in the brown, is the kurahuna. So our kurahuna are the sometimes hidden or the quiet messages that are held within our stories. And so it was really important that the whoever was using the pūrākau understood the message that was held within that story when they were using it. You'll see whakapapa is also there. So whakapapa is our genealogy or our connection to others. And so in the research, it became really clear that we had an understanding of some of the whakapapa or the genealogy that was in the story itself. So often within a pūrākau or in an Indigenous story, there'll be references to relationship connections, but also that there was an understanding of me as the clinician, my relational connections to myself, so my positionality, how that relates to the story that I'm telling. Is it from my tribe? Is it from someone else's tribe? And how it relates to the client. So is it from their tribe or not? And so to have an understanding of all those relational connections and be able to bring it together to understand if this is an appropriate story to use in this space and place. And then the final one, we labelled it mahi, which is action. So how do you take all of those considerations and bring them together with our psychological knowledge? How do we determine what we're trying to do in therapy? And is this story a good fit to complement that or to enhance that as well? So we could see from this that all 5 elements were really important considerations. And you'll see my final point there that I wanted to share from the research was people were talking with such passion about the importance of pūrākau and Indigenous storytelling for mental health and well-being, and how it can not only help us when we may be processing grief and some of those more difficult emotions, but also how it could help promote positive or protective factors associated with mental health and well-being. And therefore, one of the key recommendations from the research was to encourage the use of pūrākau outside of mental health context so that people have increased access to this healing practice and hopefully don't need to come to us as clinicians. So that's a very quick summary of my PhD research, and then I'm going to hand it over to Ellie to tell us a little bit about her rangaho and her research.
Thank you, Kerry. And following on from, I guess, what Kerry has shared, one of the common threads across our doctoral research projects is this engagement with narratives and storytelling and story making, and engagement with Indigenous practices and understandings of narratives. And as Kerry's spoken to a fair bit already, our traditional term for that is pūrākau, and so when we use that term pūrākau, we're referencing our traditional stories in particular, as well as contemporary retellings, but in particular speaking to those Indigenous narratives that are important to our peoples from our respective areas. And so the research that I was speaking to, like Kerry, is my doctoral research, the full title of which is Ko Wai Ko Wairua, Narratives of Wairua and Wellbeing. And so briefly, when I talk about wairua, to translate this as spirituality is often critiqued for being oversimplified. And so from a Māori perspective, when we speak of wairua, we are speaking about a very vast and immense experience and concept, and that wairua as spirit, as spirituality, as sacredness, as our connection to each other, to the world around us, is foundational within Te Ao Māori. It is foundational, within Te Ao Māori as in the Māori world, and it is foundational to Māori ways of knowing and to Māori ways of being in the world. And the research focused on wairua, so Māori spirituality, and therefore it was also very much about being Māori and our identity as Māori and how we make meaning of our identity and our experience as a people and peoples. And in this regard, or one of the often cited quotes when it comes to wairua for Māori is from Māori Marsden, and he says that wairua is our fundamental existence. So we are wairua first. And given all of this, it was a significant topic to explore in a research project. And so in this, I sought to understand Māori narratives and meaning making of wairua pertaining specifically to experiences of mental or psychological distress, and also to processes of psychological healing and recovery. And foundational to the approach was embedding the theory and methodology in a Māori worldview. And the focus here was to really engage with these understandings as cultural and as firmly footed in our cultural experience. Therefore, kaupapa Māori theory was essential, and likewise narrative research methodologies that were underpinned by Indigenous and Māori methodologies were also highly important. In the research in sum, I spoke with 12 Māori adults who shared their stories of their experience of wairua, or their experiences of wairua, and spirituality in regards to when they had gone through periods of psychological distress or disorder, however they chose to define that for themselves. And they also shared their stories of becoming well again, and processes of healing and processes of recovery, essentially. And what came from these narratives and what came from their storytelling and sharing were three really pertinent and powerful, perhaps is a better word, metaphors. The first being te pō te ao marama. And so this translates again in a simple form to sort of darkness and light, but within our worldview, or from our worldview, what this speaks to in a broader way are our cosmological narratives. And so our understandings and stories about how the world came to be was that there was a period of chaos and nothingness. From that came te pō, the darkness, and a long period of darkness, and from that period of darkness then came the world of light. And so when people were sharing their stories about distress through healing and recovery, te pō and te ao marama, so this idea of darkness to light, was a way for them to, or a way that they shaped their narrative sequence. And one of the key points that emerged from this is that there was a portrayal of the reoccurrence and significance of darkness and light, and that this was really a key aspect of the metaphor. And that when people were experiencing distress, the ways they described this was very much, the depths of despair, the deepest darkness. And the language that they used was that it was sometimes chaotic and all-encompassing, and that there was a pivotal point, a flicker of hope, which led to a transformation, a different or more enlightened way of being in the world. Importantly, these phases of darkness and light were often cyclical, and there were recurrent periods of distress, change, hope, and enlightenment. And states of distress and despair, so when people described this experience of te pō, of darkness, they were inevitably experiences of wairua, that they were experiences of spiritual suffering. So to suffer psychologically was to suffer spiritually. However, in the shift and movement toward te ao marama, that is the light, and the broader metaphor of enlightenment, this portrays sort of growth, or they portray growth and increased knowledge. And this was often about effect. And as it is with our pūrākau, our traditional narratives, this was a courageous pursuit of light and knowledge and a transformed experience of the world. And coming into the light was symbolic of the beginning of healing to restore psychological and, importantly, spiritual well-being. With regard to connectedness to wairua, a key understanding that emerged within the stories and narratives from people was that there was or is an inherent sacredness to wairua, and that wairua as Māori spirituality is an enduring connection to that which is sacred to Māori and sacredly Māori. And finally, with regard to cultural identity. And so unique to Māori identity and belonging is a connectedness to Māori spirituality and to wairua, and that through the disorder, and then as they moved through and toward healing and well-being, self-determination, pride, and enriched identity and belonging and healing and recovery.
So with the two contexts, was that from you, Ellie? So with those two examples, you could see that for both Ellie and I, the use of a kaupapa Māori methodology or theoretical approach to our research was really important for guiding the entire research project from the inception of the idea, but also the way in which we conducted the research, which then led to the outcomes that we'll see. So Ellie and I thought we would take the opportunity to talk a little bit about, my apologies, I'm right by the highway here in New Zealand, talk a little bit about what kaupapa Māori means in terms of psychological practice, but also in a research space as well for those who haven't heard it. Megan is also well familiar with this, so I invite her to share any thoughts that she has as well. So what I might do is start by talking a little bit about kaupapa Māori, and then I'll pass it over to you, Ellie and Megan, and what or how I came to understand a little bit about the history of the development of kaupapa Māori theory was that this came from Graham Smith in his doctoral thesis, which really looked in the education space and the ways in which our Māori, sometimes they're called language nests, are successful in terms of creating a holistic education for our children. And so from that research, him and those that he worked with developed these 6 principles that they found were really effective and fundamental, I suppose, to kaupapa Māori and a way of being and doing things in a way that has, I suppose, integrity to a Māori or is grounded in Māori culture. And so you'll see there it talks about tino rangatiratanga and the importance of us as Māori having autonomy or really leading in the work that we do. While it was in the context of education, that could then be easily transferred to the research that you do or the psychological practice that you work in or develop. We can see there the taonga tuku ihoa, which really talks about our those things that are precious to us as Māori in terms of our culture and the want to hold on and preserve our culture. And also ako Māori, so learning in culturally preferred ways. So that also includes learning in ways that might not be Māori, but preferred by people that are Māori as well. So it allows to encompass both Māori and non-Māori ways of learning or being. We can also see that it really highlights the importance of taking a socio-economic understanding of the situation that we're in, and that any kaupapa Māori research really has the aim of alleviating any socio-economic pressure or challenge faced by Māori whānau and communities. In terms of the whānau principle, that really speaks to understanding that as individuals, we're all part of larger collective groups. And that also speaks to the idea around kaupapa, that anything that is kaupapa Māori is said to contribute towards these wider visions that we have as Māori. And so when we look at those 6 principles, they are things that we should consider when we are doing things in a kaupapa Māori way. And so Linda Tuhuai Smith took these principles and ways of thinking and applied it to research and developed the Indigenous research methodology. And something that Ali and I talk a lot about is that while these are the principles and are often seen and referred to, what is really important is that underpinning all of these principles is the key of transformational change for Māori communities. And so whenever we are taking a kaupapa Māori approach to research or practice or policy and education that Megan does, we're always thinking about creating transformational outcomes for our Māori community. And that, to me as a researcher and as a practitioner, speaks to the fact that we don't do this work in isolation, and that there is wider socio-political, cultural factors that we are needing to be aware of, and that we all hold a position within those factors, and so do our clients. And so that's just a little bit, I suppose, of some important factors for me when I'm thinking about kaupapa Māori research and practice. I'm wondering for you, Ali, what you'd like to add, whether it be about their principles or the way that you apply kaupapa Māori in the mahi that you do.
Thank you, Carrie. I think I'll just extend on a couple of points that you've made there, in particular around sort of reference to the seminal text by Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, so Decolonising Methodologies. So Linda Smith and Graham Hingangaroa-Smith being two really key leaders in the development of decolonising methodologies, and in particular kaupapa Māori theory and methodologies, and they've both written extensively, and our audience may well be aware of some of their writings, but in terms of the development of the theory and the principles and the accompanying practices, both in research and also in other areas, as you've referred to, Carrie, that Graham in particular, and I'm sure Linda too, speaks to conscientisation and that consciousness raising among Māori and Indigenous peoples to pursue and enact self-determination, and that especially in the development period, the essence of the revolution at that time for Māori was around challenging prevailing ideas and inaccurate ideas, myths we might even call them, about being Māori, and challenging those, and that this was a period of, as Graham notes, a struggle for greater control over our minds. And so when we are engaging with kaupapa Māori theory, and when we're engaging with kaupapa Māori practice in our respective spaces, we are also engaging with mātauranga, and mātauranga is the expanse of Māori knowledges, and through using and drawing on Māori knowledges, we are elevating their validity and claiming space for research and practice that is very much grounded in our own ways of being, our own understandings, our own worldviews as Māori, and in this way it connects back to that central idea of tino rangatiratanga, and the positive assertion to protect and preserve Māori ways of being and knowing. And I'll just add here, oh no, I won't add that as I go on a tangent, so I'll just full stop there.
Thank you, Ali. Megan, I'm wondering, I'm mindful you're monitoring the group chat, but is there anything you would like to add to the discussion around kaupapa Māori from your policy space, or are you happy just monitoring and doing what you're doing? Okay, ka pai. You can add anything later if you like. And so the other key thread that you'll be able to see in both Ali and I's research, and also the way that we like to practice, is the importance of Māori narratives and them being central to, I suppose, how we understand our own identity, but how we want to work with whānau, and the benefits in which recognising the importance of Māori and Indigenous storytelling had to both of our research, both in the enjoyable factor of the research, but I also think that the results that we were able to, the results and insights that we were able to gain from our research. And so here Ali, I'll let you speak to the second point, as that's her real area of expertise, but just re-highlighting the importance of storytelling for healing and promoting hauora, and that it's been well documented for some time, the way in which these stories are important and have clear links to our well-being. And I'm just going to move this, sorry. And I really like this quote from Lisa Cherrington and Diana Rangihuna, who have written, they're both Māori psychologists and psychiatrists that have written on the importance of Māori storytelling, and they talk about the way in which these stories can help with connection to culture. And so you'll see in the quote that they say, if we consider the idea that one of the main mental health issues for Māori, or challenges I would say, is the loss of identity through the ongoing colonisation process, then using pūrākau immediately brings and helps to promote Māori identity and can therefore help with the presenting difficulties in which our clients are going through. And so Ali and I both use pūrākau in our clinical work. And what that might look like, if I can just quickly say, it might look like sometimes it can be telling a longer version of, say, the creation story or the different stories that Ali has alluded to, or it can be a more of a quick reference to, say, a well-known pūrākau that you know the client might know. So it may be that in one of our creation stories, it talks about the separation of Ranginui and Papatūānuku, the Sky Father and the Earth Mother, and in their separation, they're apart, and often when we see rain, we may reference rain being an expression of love or tears that the Sky Father, that Rangi feels for his wife that he's separated from. And so one thing that I see in my own practice is clients coming in, and you might see this too, and they are trying to hold all their feelings in, and they feel that they don't want to share their tears. And for a lot of Māori, we haven't had the privilege to be able to express our emotions because of some of the socio-political factors that happen in our country. We often have to hold our emotions closely to us. And so when we see this maybe more colonised view around emotions coming in, I might reference that pūrākau and the reminder that Rangi openly shares his tears for his wife, and some also say that his wife through the mist shares her grief towards her partner as well. So that might be an example in which we might reference a pūrākau or a story in session to help decolonize some of the thoughts that we have around emotions, or to help create a shift or acceptance for a client as well. And I'm wondering, Ali, if you'd like to share any way in which you've already shared some actually beautiful examples, but if there's anything you'd like to share about the way you use pūrākau with your clients, or if you'd like to speak a little bit more around pūrākau as a research methodology more broadly.
Thank you for that example, Kerry. In this bigger research project, which I won't go into now, but it is available in the doctoral publication, but essentially one of the questions that I asked people was, is there a particular pūrākau or a traditional narrative or a story generally that they connect to? And what I was really taken aback by was that everybody thought of one or identified one, and they were all very varied. So some, like you say, chose or identified the creation narrative, but particular parts of their creation narratives. Others identified well-known narratives that we heard, or we often heard retold growing up, but they had a particular way of making meaning of those stories as relevant to their lives or to their experiences. And so what I found in engaging people in that practice and research was that I guess one, maybe we might be surprised when we pose that question to people about what narrative they identify and what that means for them, and that actually that there's a real richness to that when people are offered an opportunity to share a story or to connect with a story, or at least that was my take on it in particular. And one way that that emerged in the research and the presentation of the research project was that I made a point to present these particular stories in verse form as the participants told them. So I asked them to share their understanding of the story and then presented that in the thesis write-up. In terms of pūrākau as a research methodology, I'll just quickly return to Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, and she names a decolonising approach or counter-narrative is to remember. And as she puts it, it's to remember a painful past of being colonised and dehumanised through those processes of colonisation, and to remember through the connecting of bodies and place and experience in order for healing and transformation to occur. And so if we look deeper at the practice of engaging in pūrākau and storytelling and what that might look like for peoples and cultures around the world, there is this opportunity for a different way of meeting with people. And cultures and communities throughout the world and across time have told stories, and narratives have filled our worlds and lives with meaning. And one of the key ideas that I appreciate from a narrative perspective is that it's about what's happening in that in-between space between the storyteller and the audience or the listener, and how we within that space make meaning. And so therefore listening and participating alongside people is incredibly significant and important. And finally, I'll speak briefly to Jenny Lee Morgan, who's written and researched who's researched pūrākau and Māori Indigenous approaches to narrative really beautifully, and some of her more recent writing has emphasised this idea of the inside and the heart of the matter, whereby whanaungatanga, that is the forming and maintaining of relationships and the processes of engaging in storytelling and story making, is absolutely at the heart. And Jenny Lee Morgan maintains that pūrākau are profoundly relational and therefore hold a greater meaning alongside other stories. And it is in research, and I'm sure in practice too, that the diversity of stories and story making that provides a rich and textured representation of experiences.
So now, thanks, Ali. We were maybe going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges and opportunities that we see both here in Aotearoa and also globally. And I'm also mindful that it's 15 minutes. So Megan, I was going to ask, do we have many questions in the chat? If we have a lot, I wonder if we turn to the questions. And if not, Ali and I can still talk to this point, but I do want to make sure we leave some time to answer questions if there are some.
We do have one fantastic question, which I think you've partially covered, but we might go to that because I think that will then lead on to your next part.
Excellent. Thank you, Megan.
Cool. So we've got an anonymous attendee, but great question. Do you think that the principles of kaupapa Māori are generalizable to psychology, research and practice in general, with the goal of holistic approaches, affirming cultural identity and transformational change, or are they specific to Māori communities? Of course, the specific stories may be different, but are the principles?
I'll flip back to them. Ali, do we both want to answer this?
You go
I reckon.
first.
My initial answer, I think that wherever we are and wherever we work, we can take a lot from this in terms of thinking about our positionality, the wider context that we sit in. Tino rangatiratanga is really about who has power, and whatever place that we're, wherever in the world we are, we know that there's power dynamics, and we need to be thinking about who has power and who do we need to uplift to ensure that they have power over their own well-being. And so I do think that these principles can be applied, and we've seen from a lot of Indigenous scholars globally have really resonated with Linda's work, in particular her book Decolonising Methodologies. So I would be inclined to say yes, or to at least think about how these could apply in your context. That would be my thoughts. Ellie, do you have any other thoughts, or it's okay if it's different thoughts?
I would only add to say that I think kaupapa Māori as a theory, as principles, provides a model. So rather than thinking about it as generalizable to psychology research, I think cultures around the world, inclusive of Indigenous cultures and various communities around the world, can look to kaupapa Māori, can look to this as a way of engaging in research, as a way of engaging in social, cultural, psychological issues and so forth. And so I'll speak briefly to one of the key points that I like to uphold from an Indigenous psychology's perspective, or that I hold to strongly, is that Indigenous psychologies, as I understand it, maintain that through many understandings of psychology, or understandings of psychologies and perspectives in that regard, can the broader field of psychology be enriched. So it's about seeing that there are plural rather than singular, and rather than necessarily looking to generalize, actually take learning from this, to learn from cultures different to one's own, to see these as models, and to think about how they may be applied or relevant to your particular location, your particular space, the peoples with whom you work, the peoples with whom you identify. I think that it's certainly relevant for peoples who have historically suffered the misfortune and continue to suffer the impacts of colonisation and coloniality. However, I think there is also a broader relevance for it as well.
Beautiful. And it really pushes back the idea that research and practice should take place in a vacuum, and that it encourages us to start naming spaces. So when we name Indigenous spaces, we're also naming what might be of Western influence, which we had kind of taken as normal, or not actually labelled cultural as any culture. And so I think as we start to do that more, it's going to be helpful for us as a discipline to move forward. Absolutely. Megan, did you have any other questions, or any questions yourself?
Thanks. I'd love to ask you fellas a question. I suppose, again, you've talked about it a little bit. So my background is in education, and I now have had a career change and now work in the museums industry. And so one of the things that we often talk about, particularly within Maori circles, is that there is a wide variety of understandings and lived realities for Maori. We have some who have gone through, are very close to understanding those kind of traditional ways of knowing and being. You know, we're very privileged in that we have early childhood schools, even tertiary providers now, who can teach through te reo Māori, the language of Māori, but also not only just the language, but through mātauranga Māori, kind of Māori knowledge bases. Just wondering about, as you've been doing your narrative works, both of you, how have you found, has it worked differently, or how has it worked differently or the same for different types of people who are near the beginning of their journeys to reclaim their Māori identities and Māori knowledges, versus those who have been well and truly immersed in kaupapa Māori? And I suppose why I'm asking that is, you know, kind of coming from my background when I was working in education, often our young ones in particular who are struggling, we don't want them to feel stink yet again because they don't understand some of these real basic narratives. Like, they may know really basically the story of Rangi and Papa, but you kind of don't want to make them feel worse for not understanding some of these basics. So how do you kind of manage that?
I will go first this time if you like. In brief, what I would say is that certainly in this particular research project, Māori with diverse realities, as you say, took part in the research. So some had grown up being very much embedded in their culture, and that being very, that being handed down from their grandparents, through their parents, through to them. And some were or told stories of a much more disenfranchised experience of growing up feeling ashamed to identify as Māori because of the portrayals that they saw in media, often being highly negative, and so on and so forth. Although there were these quite diverse experiences for people throughout their lives, what they overwhelmingly identified with was the strength of their cultural identity, and this path to reconnection and connectedness looked different for them, but essentially what they spoke to was the benefits and value that they found in connecting with, exploring, learning about their identity, be that through learning the language, te reo Māori, be it through learning about their genealogy and whakapapa, be it through engaging in song, engaging in our cultural practices, and some even, talked about the most simple of things, such as sharing food with friends and family, and that being a really significant cultural practice for them. And so overall, although people came with very different stories and experiences, even those who had knowledge of te reo Māori, our language, and had a strong footing in where they came from and that place that gave them strength, even they said actually the realization that they had the tools to be able to engage in healing themselves, and to be able to do that from a Māori, from a cultural perspective, was very, I guess, a strong metaphor and aspect within the stories that I heard.
Beautiful. And what came to mind and what I also heard when Ellie was talking is the importance of dignity of those that we're working with, and uplifting the mana, the inherent specialness or prestige that the clients that we work with. And so at different stages, like you're right, Megan, it's going to look different. So for a client or someone like myself, who very much went through the process of learning the stories, one of the key outcomes is more going to be about how do we uplift that person's mana or their dignity while they learn, so that they actually feel really good about themselves when they learn. And then it might look really different for someone that, a lot of my whai ora have a lot more cultural knowledge than me. And so when they come in, this is an awesome opportunity to reduce that power imbalance and uplift their mana, because I can say, what do you know about the story? What does it mean to you? And so I think that's why it's so important that we don't just learn the story itself, but that story has an understanding of, we have that wider understanding of te ao Māori, so what the values are, so that we're delivering the story consistent with our values of manaaki, of uplifting other people's mana and dignity, of respect, and also so that we understand the kurahuna, because if we understand the kurahuna or those hidden messages within the story, and we live those, then actually in doing so, we're going to deliver the story in a way that is consistent with the underlying message, but also in a way that's consistent with our Māori values. And all our Māori values encourage us to uplift the mana and the dignity of others. And so I think whatever place in the continuum someone sits, if we're always going back to that value, and some of those values also align to our psychologist's code of ethics, then that's a really important consideration and place to start.
Kia ora, thanks for that. We do have another question. Oh, it's a doozy. Are Indigenous and decolonising approaches to research different? Do they overlap, and are they distinct in some ways?
Ellie
probably
actually
a PhD.
lectures around this topic. So my friend, can I pass that over to you?
Of course. I will briefly just say that sometimes they overlap and sometimes they are different. What I'll say about Indigenous approaches or methodologies is that they are founded and develop, I guess, from the bottom up in terms of being founded in that particular cultural worldview and then being developed from there. Whereas decolonising methodologies may not necessarily be. Decolonising can encompass, I would say, many things. But at the same time, an Indigenous methodology can be decolonising in that it's saying, well, actually, our Indigenous, from our perspective, our Māori approaches are valid, they are legitimate, and they are of value when we are engaging in research. And simply by engaging in that process, we are engaging in a decolonial or decolonising approach. Whereas on the flip side, a decolonising approach may not necessarily be developed from the ground up in terms of being founded in a particular Indigenous or cultural worldview. So they aren't the same, they may overlap, and that I guess what they share is a challenge to prevailing and dominant ways of doing research that have often had a negative impact or continue to disenfranchise or engage in coloniality towards Indigenous peoples.
That's a flaming amazing segue into the question that you've got on your board. We've got 4 minutes left, so not sure if you could just give us a few highlights of what are the challenges and opportunities for psychology in Aotearoa and globally.
I'm going to jump in here and say that Kerry and I are actively involved in advocating for presently for greater representation and participation by Māori within our psychology workforce here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So this has been some research and work that we've been working on for the last year or so. That one of the key challenges is that our representation within our workforce here is relatively low, and that we need more Māori. We need greater diversity, broadly speaking, but in particular, we are seeking to grow our workforce, grow our Māori workforce in particular. And so we see this challenge as an opportunity to encourage and enact greater Māori participation and leadership within the field. Kerry, handing over to you.
I would agree. If I was to say the greatest challenge that we face is, and what might be of interest to people, is here in Aotearoa, we import a lot of our psychological knowledge, from the Western psych powerhouses, whether it be America or Europe. And so a challenge for us as Indigenous people is to go, what parts of that are meaningful for us? And then also, how do we remember our ways of healing? And then actually to have the skill of bringing the two together. And that does take a lot of skill to understand both and then think, how do we bring the two together in a way that doesn't premise Western science as more important or more valid than our knowledge system? And so in having that conversation, that's why Ali and I and other Māori psychologists have continued to advocate for building the capacity and the capability of our workforce. And when we're doing that, we need more Māori and Indigenous psychologists, and then for us to connect with other, and hopefully there's some on the call, other Indigenous psychologists globally, to think about how we take on this, actually what is a global workforce challenge. And so we recently launched this workforce goal, which is Vimaro Ki Tua, and it's actually quite an ambitious goal for us in New Zealand, but it's the idea to produce 500 new Māori psychologists by 2034, and Ali and I and others in this space see this so important for building Māori psychologies, both in terms of research and practice, but also what it really comes down to, and what Ali and I are so passionate about, is ensuring that when our community needs or wants support, that they have access to a clinician that can provide that in a way that's meaningful for them. And so that would be a challenge, but an opportunity that we are really excited about tackling, hopefully, with the help of others.
And just to note there that this is has been a long-standing goal for Māori within the field of psychology, so clinical psychologists and also those from other scopes of practice. And our seniors, so those who we look to as leaders in the field, have for a long time advocated for a transformation of psychology, and it is that which Māori psychologists seek here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that our psychology look different, that it look unique, that it be unique for Aotearoa, New Zealand, and that it serve our communities, and in particular our Māori communities.
I think that's us, and we haven't done bad with time.
Brilliant for time.
Thank you so much for moderating.
I didn't have to do very much, but I will just finish with another karakia. Ki runga, ki raro, ki roto, ki wao, re 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 au, pai Māori re. So above us, below us, between us, within us, let there be peace.
Beautiful. Thank you, Megan.
Kia ora koutou.
Thank you so much, everybody. As we are coming to the final moment, we really appreciate your time and we really appreciate this conversation. So for any of us, wrong slide, for any of us who are interested in additional conferences and webinars, please join us at our next webinars that are coming up with ICP. We have one that's scheduled for November 12th, which will be on United Arab Emirates, looking at ethical practices, and as well as November 21st. How long does the war last? Lessons from Croatia. So again, thank you so much for joining us this morning, this evening, this night, and we appreciate you truly. Again, any information that you're interested in, please send us the email. The certificate of attendance will be sent automatically for anybody that's been on here for about 40 minutes. I think we're at the end of it. We welcome any other suggestions and we welcome you in our next presentation.